fresh off Pitt's first loss of the season, which with any luck will be their worst loss of the season. I thought we could take a look back about how Pitt has responded to really tough losses like that, really bad losses, blowout losses like the one the Panthers suffered at SMU on Saturday night, and how they've responded under Pat Narduzzi, entering year 10 now. How many times have they had a blowout loss like that? And what happened the next week? What happened in the next game? I thought we could look into that a little bit today on the Morning Pit. I thought we could update something from yesterday that we talked about when we talked about fixing the offense and some of the key elements that need to improve in the offense. I got the old legal pad out and found some interesting things. We got different legal pads. This is the legal pad that I think makes an interesting case about something we talked about yesterday. This is the legal pad that has the some of the biggest losses in the Narduzzi era and how they bounce back. This is the legal pad that has the play-by-play from the Radford game, and before that, the SMU game. I think that's it. I think I just have the 3 legal pads. I only need 2 of them today. I got a blank legal pad over there, over on the other side of the desk, which we don't need yet because we still have these going. Although this one here, we're running low on the pages. This is why we always have an extra legal pad at the ready. We won't need all 3 legal pads today, but we'll need at least 2 of them to talk about bouncing back from big losses. A key element of the offense that I probably didn't give enough credit to yesterday that could be something Pitt could focus on, and an interesting list for Eli Holstein to show up on that maybe should remind us all of the player he's been and the player he could potentially be here in the final 4 games. Bunch of different topics to hit on today, and we'll try and get to all of them and give them all proper justice here on the Thursday edition of the Morning Pit on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. All right, it's Thursday here on the Morning Pit on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Of course, I'm Chris Peak from Panther-Lair.com. Sometimes I don't always say that. Sometimes I just sort of assume that you know it, and that's why you're tuning in. But if you're new to the program, we appreciate you checking us out here on the Morning Pit on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. This is our little morning talk show we do every day of the week, Monday through Friday. A little bit of Pitt sports talk to get your day started. Sometimes 20 minutes, sometimes 25, sometimes 30. It all depends on how long I want to talk about the topics we want to talk about today. And we've certainly got a few things that we want to get to. Now, of course, what we always ask you to do, like this video and subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Those of you listening just on the audio podcast on Spotify or Apple or wherever you may be hearing it, you don't have the option to like and subscribe, but you could always come over to YouTube and do it at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. We'd appreciate that. And then check out the website below, Panther-Lair.com, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com for all the Pitt sports news you can possibly handle. Pitt football, Pitt basketball, Pitt recruiting, and message boards to talk to other Pitt fans. It's the best online community of Pitt fans you're going to find, hanging out all day, every day at Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. All right. Big losses. Pitt, of course, lost by 23 at SMU on Saturday. Pretty big loss, a blowout loss, and the kind of loss that we haven't seen too much of in recent years. As a matter of fact, so I went through, and that's what legal pad number 1 is for. I charted out all of the losses by 20 points or more that Pat Narduzzi has suffered since he's been at Pitt, and charted from 2015 to 2023. So I didn't get into this year yet. We'll add that to the list, obviously. But I wanted to look back at how, because I mean the biggest question right now is how is Pitt going to respond to that loss at SMU? And so I wanted to look back at how did Pitt respond to previous 20-point losses. Now, not going to be a perfect predictor of what this team will do. Lots of different players, lots of different situations, but it's interesting, I think, a little bit. I think it's a little bit interesting to look at some of these games and see how Pitt did in the aftermath of big losses. And one thing that's interesting to me, 2015 to 2023, 9 full seasons, Pitt has had 10 losses by 20 points or more under Pat Narduzzi. 9 seasons, 10 games lost. What's interesting is there was a stretch between, if you remember in 2020 when they went to Clemson, they got blown out. Kenny Pickett threw a bunch of interceptions. It was an ugly game. They didn't have another loss by 20-plus points until the Notre Dame game last year. They went 28 games without losing a game by 20 or more. Now, they didn't lose a ton of games in that stretch. After the Clemson game in 2020, they won at Georgia Tech. Obviously, in 21, they went 11-3. The next year, they went 9-4. So, getting up to the Notre Dame game, though, there were a handful of losses in 2023. But a 28-game stretch of not getting blown out like that. Now, you lose by 19, that's not much better, but we got to pick a cutoff point at, somewhere in there. So we went with 20. So that's the first thing that stands out. There were 3 seasons under Pat Narduzzi where there's not been a 20-point loss. His first year, 2015, they didn't lose a game by 20 points or more. 2021 and 2022, like I just mentioned, they didn't lose a game by 20 points or more. Now, what happened after those games? The 10 losses by 20 points or more. This is what I'm interested in because I want to see what history tells us. Well, it's right down the middle. Pitt is 5-5 in games following a loss by 20 points or more under Pat Narduzzi. So you can go back to last year when they lost that game at Notre Dame 58-7. They came home for their next game. They hosted Florida State and they lost that game 24-7. Now, as I started charting this and worked backward chronologically, right? Reverse chronological order. So I was like, well, you know what? Because I went into this thinking, well, it'd be great if I could find out that they always won after they lost by 20 points. They always bounce back with a victory. And right off the bat, the first one I look at is the Notre Dame game last year, and they didn't bounce back from that with a victory. They lost to Florida State the next week. So I said, well, there goes that idea. But that was a valiant effort. That game against Florida State. I mean, they were in there. They hung in there more than a team that lost by 51 the previous week would be expected to hang in against a top 10 team. I think Florida State was at that point. And they really gave them a run for their money. I mean, they were in the game late. I mean, there was a Kanate Mumfield fumble out of the end zone, gave possession to Florida State, even though he had his face mask turned halfway around his head, probably leading to the fumble, which helped Florida State's cause in that regard. But I looked at it and said, well, that's a loss, but that's not a terrible loss. It's okay. I mean, it's not okay. I mean, you would prefer that they win. But then you go back before that. What were their 20-point losses before that? Well, you go back to 2020. And again, Notre Dame pops up here. They lost to Notre Dame at home 45-3. One of the real bottom points, one of the lowest points of the Narduzzi era, maybe the lowest point, if only to be surpassed last season. But that Notre Dame game was brutally bad. I think it was their 3rd loss in a row, or 4th loss in a row, actually, because they lost to NC State, Boston College, at Miami, and then Notre Dame at home. And then they had a bye week after that. Paris Ford opted out. I mean, it felt like everything was falling apart, and that was certainly the impression. It's how it seemed to be. Well, the next game after their off week, they went to Florida State, and you probably recall they won 41-17. Put that one in the W column. Later that season, they have a game again at Clemson. Again, that one I talked about a minute ago, 52-17. Pretty bad loss. It was a blowout. The next week, or the next game, I should say, because there was a little bit of time in there. Clemson was on November 28th, so it was 12 days later. They played at Georgia Tech and closed the 2020 season with a win. So 2 wins after 20-point losses and 1 loss after one. So they're 2-1, right? 2019 didn't go that way. Remember, they had the game at Virginia Tech where they lost 28-0. They came home for the final game of the regular season and lost to Boston College 26-19. Excuse me. Not a good turnaround there. 2018, they actually had 4 losses by 20 points or more. So that team, everybody knows they went 7-7, 7-5 in the regular season, right? And then they lost to Clemson in the ACC championship game and Stanford in the Sun Bowl. So 7-7, 4 out of their 7 losses were by 20 points or more. Of course, there was the Penn State game, the 51-6 game. There was the game at UCF when they lost 45-14. They lost at Miami in the regular season finale 24-3, and then Clemson beat them 42-10 in the ACC championship game. Split results of these 4 games. After the 51-6 Penn State game, they beat Georgia Tech at home. After the UCF game, another game that felt like a low point of the Narduzzi era, and it certainly was, they came home, they took on Syracuse and beat them in overtime. The Miami game, the Clemson game, not so much, partially because those 2 games were back-to-back. So they followed the loss at Miami by 21 points. They followed that by losing to Clemson by 32 in the ACC championship game, and they followed that by losing to Stanford in the Sun Bowl. So you have a couple of losses there, 2 wins after 20-point losses and 2 losses after 20-point losses that season. 2017, they had 1 loss by that much. They lost 59-21 against Oklahoma State. For as much as that team struggled, I should say, going 5-7, they only had 1 blowout loss to that extreme. They lost by 38 to Mason Rudolph and those guys. The next week, they went to Georgia Tech and lost again, 35-17. A lot of quarterback shifting in and out. That one wasn't good. But the first 20-point loss of the Narduzzi era was actually a 23-point loss in 2016. They were at Miami, a real low point of that season that a lot of people don't think about or don't remember when they talk about how good the 2016 team was. And I think it had its real upsides and certainly some highlight moments. But they went to Miami and they just got their butts kicked. I think Pitt might have had a kickoff return touchdown to open the game, and it was pretty much all downhill after that. Well, a week later, they go to Clemson. We know what happened in that game, 43-42 wins. So 5 wins, 5 losses in 10 games where they lose by 20 points or more. I think a couple things are interesting. One, if you look at it's 9 seasons leading into this year. So 9 seasons from 15 to 23, 10 losses over those 9 seasons. 6 of those 10 losses were in the first 4 years. The 4 games in 2018, the 1 in 16, the 1 in 17. They've only had 4 of those kinds of losses in the last 5 years. Virginia Tech in 2019, the 2 games in 2020, Notre Dame and Clemson, and then the Notre Dame game last year. So, 1 game in the last 3 years prior to this. Now 2 games out of the last 4 years leading back to 21, 22, 23, 24. They've only had 4 of these kinds of losses. Only 2 of these kinds of losses. The Notre Dame game last year and the SMU game this year. And so, I think trending in the right direction in that regard of not, because we're talking about how you bounce back from these kinds of losses, these 20-point losses. You really don't want to have these kinds of 20-point losses in the first place, right? Like the first step to avoiding, the question of how you bounce back from these losses is don't take these losses. Like don't lose games by 20 plus. Be a little more competitive. But, I think with the level Pitt recruits at, and generally sort of the state of the program, you're probably going to have this happen every now and then where you're going to get outclassed or out-talented or out-coached and probably a little bit of all 3 every now and then. It's going to happen. And certainly Saturday night you had a confluence of events between the coaching, the talent, the play, the execution. I mean, there were a lot of things that favored SMU, a team that would probably beat Pitt most times out of 10, but not necessarily beat them by 23. Most times out of 10. It would probably be a little bit more competitive, but you had a lot of circumstances conspire on that night of pretty much everything that could go wrong did go wrong. But I think when you look at the bounce backs, even the FSU game last year, I think was a solid bounce back from the Notre Dame game. They didn't win, but they were able to, I think, be more competitive than probably a lot of people would have assumed after they lost the game 58-7 the previous week. And then in 2020, they bounced back from both big losses. The 45-3 game against Notre Dame, they bounced back by going to Florida State and winning. The 52-17 game at Clemson, they bounced back by going to Georgia Tech and winning. So, there's a positive trend there, I think, of how this team responds. I don't get too much into the player meeting thing. I think we talked about this earlier in the week. J.J. Lasser, the receivers coach, mentioned it on Tuesday, that the players had a player-only meeting on Sunday. Konate Mumfield said they wanted to keep it in-house of what they talked about. I think it's important that the players have some sense of self-awareness about what's at stake here, about where they could go from here, about the kind of crossroads they're facing after that loss, where they're still at 7-1 and there's still a lot that they can accomplish. But if they have sort of the same approach in these next 4 games that they seemingly had in the SMU game, then the results are not going to be what they want them to be or hope they will be or expect them to be. And so I think it's good to see that. We've heard a lot about the closeness of this team and their brotherhood and all of that kind of thing. And, well, this is where that needs to come through. This is where they need to lift each other up and they need to hold each other accountable. And, I think those are some of the key elements to engineering a bounce back, which they've done, I think, pretty well with over the years. Not always perfect. Like I said, they're 5-5 in those games. But I think there are a lot of encouraging games in there. You know what I mean? To bounce back to go to Florida State and win. To bounce back and go to Clemson and win. I mean, a number of these games being on the road as well, these bounce back games. I think they've done a decent job with it. So we'll see. Yesterday I talked about ways to fix the offense. One thing I talked about was the running game. They need to be more effective. They got to be more effective on the run. They're just not getting that consistent production out of the run that they need. And then I would actually look through and chart it out. What this is right here. This is every running back rushing attempt in the last 3 games. Because I wanted to see, what are they actually doing in these games? What kind of productivity are they getting out of the running game? And if you look at those 3 games, there's 55 total running back rushing attempts. And what I found is that 29 out of those 55 gained 4 yards or more, which I think is an impressive number. You know, I don't know what would be coaches would like to get. I'm sure coaches would like to get 4 yards or more on every running back rushing attempt. But when you're getting it more than half the time, I think there's an opportunity to be effective. One of the biggest things, and I was sort of surprised to arrive at this conclusion, and I'm not entirely sold on it yet, but I kind of think it might be the case that maybe they actually need to run more. Like when you look at, I mean, the SMU game, that's a tricky one, but Syracuse in the first half, they ran 23 offensive plays. 9 of them were running back rushing attempts. You know, Cal in the first half, they had 26 offensive plays. 10 were running back rushing attempts, and that included the 72-yard run on 4th and 1 from Desmond Reed, which gave them 118 rushing yards in the first half from the running backs, just from the running backs on those 10 rushing attempts. You say, well, yeah, of course they had 118. They had a 72-yard run. Well, that's fine. You take that 72-yard out, you still end up with 46 rushing yards on 9 attempts, which is better than 5 yards per carry. How do your running backs? We're just talking about running backs. We're not talking about sacks. We're not talking about quarterback runs or anything like that. We're just talking about running back rushing attempts. Second half against Cal, they had 30 offensive plays, 9 running back rushing attempts. They're getting solid production. Again, better than 50%. Better than 50% of their running back rushing attempts in the last 3 games have gained 4 yards or more. Seems like maybe you should do a little more of that. And it feels like a weird thing to suggest. I mean, after the offense that we watched over the last 2 years and what kind of difference I think a lot of people wanted to see, what kind of change a lot of people wanted to see in the offense this year, and what kind of change we have seen in this offense this year. Obviously, it's a passing-based offense, but there might be success to be had here. There might be opportunities where you can get a little bit more. Because in that first half against Cal, you know, where I said they had 10 running back rushing attempts for 118 yards, or even if you want to take the 72 out, that's fine. You go 9 for 46. They attempted 13 passes in that half and averaged 4.2 yards per attempt. So you're averaging 4.2 yards per passing attempt in the first half against Cal. You're averaging better than 5 yards per running back rushing attempt, not even counting the 72-yard run. Like set that aside as like a wild, crazy thing, although you can't entirely set that aside because that's a potential that you have when you give the ball to Desmond Reed. You know, if you include that, they're averaging like 11 yards per running back rushing attempt in the first half against Cal, more than double what you're getting on per passing attempt against Cal in the first half. And the yards per attempt never really improved. Second half against Cal, it was 5.2. First half against Syracuse, it was 4.0. First half against SMU was 5.5. The second half against Syracuse, they actually averaged 8.3 yards per attempt passing. Part of that is because Eli Holstein, and you might not have realized this, and this is actually a good segue into our next thing. Eli Holstein in the second half against Syracuse, 6 of 6 for 72 yards and a touchdown. Yeah. 6 of 6, 72 yards and a touchdown before he got hurt and had to come out of the game. He had a 29-yard pass to Poppy Williams for the touchdown, 21-yard pass, or 29 to Raphael Williams for the touchdown, 21 to Gavin Bartholomew, and then a couple of sub-10 passing, 6 yards to Kenny Johnson, 5 yards to Kenny Johnson, 8 yards to Kenny Johnson, 3 yards to Gavin Bartholomew. 6 of 6 for 72 is a pretty solid performance, I would say, in the second half against Syracuse. And that brings me up to our next thing. Eli Holstein on Wednesday was named a semifinalist for the Sean Alexander Freshman of the Year award. And it's funny when I get these emails. It's funny, to see something like that, where on one hand I've got the message boards and the Pitt fans on Twitter and you guys who comment on YouTube and all these things talking about how Holstein's struggling. Maybe they need to replace him. I'm going to write about it in the 3-2-1 column tomorrow about whether they should make a change, whether they should give Nate Arnell an opportunity or whatever. It's a real conversation happening. Even if Pat Narduzzi's disappointed in Jerry DePaula for asking the question, it's a real conversation that's happening, I think, around the Pitt community of like, should they give Yarnell a shot here? I think there's a lot of ins and outs of that. I'm not going to go down that road right now because I think it's a little bit. We probably should have done a whole episode on that this week, but we didn't. But we're having that conversation, and the Maxwell Football Club, who hands out the Sean Alexander Freshman of the Year award, is looking at Eli Holstein and saying, this guy's one of the best freshmen in the country. And some of that is looking at the overall performance, the stats, the body of work, which I think Pitt fans lose sight of with the most recent game. And even, in the case of, Holstein, really his last 3 games where he hasn't played at the same level as his first 5. But I think it's important to keep in mind what he showed in the first 5 games. And again, it wasn't 60 minutes in any of those 5 games, but he, on multiple occasions made big time throws. And even, continuing into the last 3. Whatever you want to say, and I think he's struggled, and I think he would probably concede that he has struggled. He's also made some big-time throws. Like I say, Syracuse game, 29-yard touchdown pass, 21-yard pass to Gavin Bartholomew. I was just looking at third downs recently. Fourth quarter, he converts a third down. He converted a couple third downs with passes. One to Dejon Reynolds, 12 yards for a 3rd and 7, a 21-yard pass to, or actually Nate Arnell threw the 21-yard pass to Malachi Thomas, so we won't throw that one in there. But he had a 24-yard pass to Kenny Johnson on 3rd and 4 at SMU. See some of the other ones that he had here. The 20-yard pass to Sincere Lee against Syracuse was a 3rd and 5 conversion. I'm just looking at my chart of third down plays here and what they've been able to accomplish and the plays that they've made. My point is he has struggled in the last 3 games. He hasn't been completely bereft of good plays, though. He still had a few moments in each game where he made the kind of throws that he made in the first 5 that got everybody excited, that earned him ACC Rookie of the Week honors, and now has gotten him onto the Maxwell Football Club Sean Alexander Freshman of the Year award watch list, or semifinalist is what it is. It's not even a watch list. It's a semifinalist. And I think it's probably important to keep that in mind. Like when you're watching Eli Holstein, or you're thinking about this question of whether they should make a change or something, remember that he has shown a whole lot of promise and potential through 8 games this season. He has shown a whole lot this season. And again, you would always like it to be steps forward. You always like it to be improvement and getting better and making big plays and better and better and better. And sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes there are steps back. And that's, I think, natural for any redshirt freshman or young player or inexperienced player who's getting playing time for the first time in their careers, which is the case with Eli Holstein. And so, I think it's important to keep in mind. And sometimes getting an email that Eli Holstein's on the Sean Alexander Freshman of the Year Award semifinalist, that he is a semifinalist for the Sean Alexander Freshman of the Year Award, it can be a reminder that, okay, he's struggled the last few games, but there's a whole lot of potential here. There's a whole lot of talent here. And again, that conversation we came back to in August. Where's the upside? Who gives you the most upside? And maybe if you're a Pitt fan, we're getting into this conversation. Darn it, I didn't want to. But maybe if you're a Pitt fan, you say, you know what? Upside's great. I need the higher floor. I need that guy who's going to be a little bit steadier, and maybe that's Nate Yarnell. But the upside is there with Holstein. And I think it's important to keep all of those things in mind as we go forward of how good he's been so far this season at various points and how much upside there really is and how good he could potentially become if he keeps developing. So we'll see what happens there. Tomorrow we got our mailbag. If you want to submit a question for the mailbag, go to the message boards at Panther-Lair.com, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com to get all your Pitt sports coverage that you can possibly handle and to submit a question for the mailbag on our Between Fifth and Forbes message board. So go do that. We'd love to have your questions for tomorrow. I always enjoy doing the mailbag episodes. It's always fun to get those questions. So go over to the message board, submit your question, and we'll answer as many as we can tomorrow. All right, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. That way you won't miss any of our Pitt video content. We will be live after the Virginia game on Saturday night. It's going to be late, and it's going to be lively, and it's going to be loud. I don't know. Something else that starts with the letter L. But it'll be fun. I know that. We'll have a good time. Win or lose, we'll have something to talk about for sure. So like and subscribe. Check out the site. Have a great Thursday, and we'll talk to you tomorrow for the Morning Pitt mailbag right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.